Hello and welcome back to Historical Correctness for part 2 of Glory. In the last part, I talked about the historical background of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, which not only effectively linked the death of slavery as a way to end the war, but for the first time allowed the enlistment of African American males into the Federal Army. Massachusetts was the first state to officially create the first all-black military unit, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and leading it was Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a Boston native who is the only son of prominent abolitionists. I also went over Shaw's historical background and talked about how it was largely absent from the film, leaving his thoughts on the war and slavery ambiguous to say the least. I also touched on how the regiment itself was created and how it wasn't as straightforward as presented in the film, that there was a lot of behind the scenes work just to make it happen. But while it has plenty of support, it has just as much as, if not more, dissidence of the plan, based on the belief that black men were too cowardly in nature to make good soldiers. Even so, thousands of eager men poured in from all across the country into Boston in the hopes of having the chance to fight against the Confederacy, permanently destroy slavery in the country, and prove to the entire nation that they were just as men as anybody. If you haven't got the chance to watch part 1, just click on the icon on top that will take you there and you can get the full story and be caught up for part 2 of this video. There's no rush, I can wait. Oh, back already? Alright then, on to the story. As I've mentioned, the recruitment process took much longer in real life than it did in the movie. Not only did men came from all across the Union, but many came up from 5 slave states, all hoping for the opportunity to fight. However, while they were eager to quickly fill up the ranks, it didn't mean that they weren't picky with the recruits. The very first thing that each and every black recruit had to do before they can be accepted into the military and sent into training was to pass a rigorous physical examination. It was estimated that about a third of the applicants were rejected through this process. It may seem cruel and unfair as they came all this way just to be sent back home, but Shaw, as the regiment's commanding officer, wants the best men he could get his hands on. If there was one thing that Shaw completely understood was how at best mixed were the opinions about the enlistment of African Americans into the Federal Army to fight in an ongoing war. Because of this special circumstance, he was certain that every curious eye in the Union, both supporter and skeptic, will be watching him and his men very closely, and fully understood that one slip-up could spell the end of the whole thing before they had a chance to get up from the ground, and would be a historic blemish on his honor. Despite being a poor offensive player in the war, General McClellan did boost his army's potential with discipline, in which Shaw himself had witnessed, and so decided to do the same with his regiment, in which they were called methods of corrosion. The first sign of this that we see in the film was when Shaw admonished his subordinate officer, childhood friend Cabot Forbes, played by Carrie Hughes, for fraternizing with Thomas, a violation of military decorum. It may seem unfair, but the line between officers and enlisted men shouldn't be crossed as it will give off favoritism. Even those two know better. This continues as the regiment would drill continuously out in the mud and puddles, which its purpose was to install endurance, strength, and most importantly, discipline. And once they were issued rifles, Shaw demonstrated a simulation battle just to give them a taste of what they would be facing, as it would be the true test to their manhood.
Do it! Do it! Do it!
While it was all done with good intentions, Ford failed to see that as he confronts Shaw for his harsh handling of the men.
I'm getting these men ready for battle.
Robert. They're already as good as the 7th ever was. They march well, they're disciplined.
No thanks to you.
I beg your pardon? You heard me.
I'm sure there are some of you that may side with Forbes while others will understand Shaw's point of view. But my purpose for this is not to argue what should be the best for the regiment, but to compare to how the real Shaw handled the training. From what I gathered, it would seem that the real Shaw ruled the camp with an iron fist compared to the film version. Here are a few ground rules that were set in place under his command. For any unruly privates, they were forced to stand on barrels for many hours or had them gagged with their feet and hands tied together. Insubordination was not tolerated, and he made it quite clear with his men that it would be dealt with a firing squad. However, as far as I can tell, he had never carried out the threat. And as a way to show to the enlisted black men that they weren't exclusively susceptible to these harsh punishment due to their race, white officers were not spared, which was unsurprisingly unpopular among them. It was seen as so unusual that the general who ran the camp filed a damning complaint against Shaw, calling him out on his excessive punishments that went far and beyond what was acceptable in regulations. Which now brings me to what is arguably the most emotional scene of the entire film. Sallius Tripp, a former slave, was captured after seemingly attempting to desert the army. As punishment, he is to be flogged or whipped in front of the entire regiment to serve as a deterrent for anybody who ever think about going AWOL. However, things get a little awkward when Tripp shows that his body is completely covered in scars, obviously caused by whipping, as it was sadly the way of life of a slave. Still, believing that he needs to install discipline into his men, Shaw continued with his order, much to the disgust of Forbes, and Tripp himself seemed almost vindicated in his belief that Shaw was no different than any white man he knew from the South. Once the punishment commenced, as if reliving the horrors, Tripp for the first time dropped his guard. Man, them feels, am I right? Although, now that I think about it, I don't believe that I come across that Shaw ever used whipping as a form of punishment, not even as a threat. Does that mean that he was self-conscious of the implication with the whip? I seriously doubt it, to be honest. Hang on just a moment, I want to do a bit of digging on this subject. I'll be right back. Well, you know, there is a perfectly good reason why Shaw never used the whip on his men. To put it bluntly, it's illegal. Yeah, it turns out that the Federal Army abolished flogging as a form of punishment all the way back in August of 1861. And let me remind you that this story takes place in 1863. So, if the real Shaw had done this, he will be facing some serious consequences for it, which includes being court-martialed. Even if it doesn't go down that road, this would have led him to be dismissed from his post immediately and be replaced with someone else. How far lasting it would be on American history and whether we'll have any changes on the course of the war is debatable, and that is something I don't want to touch with a 100-foot pole. The point I want to get at is that I don't know if the filmmakers didn't know about it or they did know and just say fuck it and put it in there because it's a powerful scene regardless of the historical inaccuracy, but it does bring to the forefront of what the war is ultimately about. Slavery and the inhumane treatment that African Americans have to endure for centuries. Through this punishment, we get a taste of that brutal reality. Regardless, as harsh as it may seem, the end result seems to speak for themselves. There was hardly any drunkenness among the men, and only a few ever got sent to the guardhouse. And as far as the black men were concerned, they seemed quite aware of the stakes than anybody else with the exception of Shaw. Gooding, one of the few men who wrote of his experience with the 54th, said that Shaw didn't use, quote, slavish fear, but obedience enacted by the evidence of a superior and directing mind, unquote. In other words, Shaw was very stern, but was a fair man. But that didn't mean that everything went hunky-dory. Even if it was legal, flogging was still a violent form of punishment that would tear through the flesh and potentially lame a person. Still, the army on both sides had to combat desertion. Truth be told, we never had much of a military through much of our history. At most, there will be a few thousand trained officers and enlisted men, with the bulk made up from militias, which were quite unreliable when it came to their performance on the battlefield due to them being made up of civilians. With the onslaught of the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of volunteers were civilians and from the very beginning had to adjust their thinking from an individual into a single mass through rough training and drilling. This, along with the terrible living conditions where they were more likely to be killed by a mosquito than a bullet, often led to soldiers deserting the army, which had been a common occurrence by the time blacks were finally allowed to fight in the war. Shaw tried to minimize this issue as best he could, but it was reported that about 15 to 20 had deserted from the regiment during training and were never heard from again. The reason why he would be worried about this is because, once again, the public wouldn't be looking at it on a case-by-case basis, but equate the very few who went AWOL to those who stayed as if proof that the entire race were all cowards. Thankfully, it seemed to have never come to that, and over the months, Shaw managed to change the minds of even the most skeptical. For the most part, things went pretty smoothly up until they were ready by the end of May of 1863. Oh, and that whole subplot about uniforms being intentionally delayed by the federal commissary, that's all fiction as far as I can tell, because I've never come across something like that in my research. Every black man received their uniform on their first day of enlistment. Although the whole pay controversy did happen, but I'll save that one for later. Now, with the regiment ready to go to war, the city of Boston held a triumphant parade in their honor, and soon afterwards, Shaw and the 54th head down for South Carolina. Placed under the leadership of General Quincy Adams Gilmore, the newly appointed commander of the Department of the South, the 54th traveled by water, landing on Port Royal Island in South Carolina. With much of the coastline extending down into Florida under federal control, the biggest prize was the port city of Charleston, the birthplace of the now 3-year conflict. With the city in their hands, not only would it strengthen their hold in the deep South, it could potentially have a powerful demoralizing effect on the rebellious states, not to mention revenge for the loss of Fort Sumter. However, it would not be easy to take the city. In fact, things haven't been going so well with the siege. Along with Sumter, Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island had been protecting the city with ease. Not only that, but Fort Johnson on James Island and Battery Wagner on Morris Island not only strengthened the defenses that made naval invasion an impossibility, but that it made an invasion by land very dangerous. For Gilmore, there was no question that taking out the defenses was top priority. This seemed to be the perfect opportunity for the new regiment to show off what they can do. But the department seemed to have other plans for them. As soon as the 54th arrived on the island, they marched to the town of Beaufort, where they came across black Southerners who, after hearing rumors of Union black troops, finally got to see them with their own eyes. Here they were greeted by black and white abolitionists and teachers, all enthusiastic of the proud display of the troops, including the one and only Harriet Tubman, who worked as a spy for the department. After setting up camp, they were quickly given fatigue work, which consisted of fortification and road work, a long way from the expectations of fighting against the rebels. But soon they were given the chance, as they were personally invited by Colonel James Montgomery to join him and his unit on a mission to a small town called Darien in Georgia. As the 54th's first assignment, the goal of the mission, as Douglas R. Egerton explained in his book, Thunder at the Gates, traditional rules of war allow for the confiscations of materials of foodstuff that aided either combatants. Darien's waterfront storehouses and mills held large quantities of rice, ricin, and cotton, the last of which, smuggled through the American naval blockade, helped keep the wilting Confederate economy afloat. By the time they arrived, it was more or less a ghost town, but Montgomery ordered the town to be cleaned out anyway, letting loose his 2nd South Carolina Volunteers to run wild. Undisciplined and rowdy, this is what Montgomery has to say about black troops in general.
Look around you, look at them. You really think anybody's gonna put these boys into some real combat? Do you? I mean, they're little children, for God's sake. They're little monkey children, and you just gotta know how to control them.
I think right now I do like to go into a bit of a background on the real Colonel Montgomery and compare him to the film version. James Montgomery was one of the first settlers in the Kansas Territory before it became a state. There he took part in the rising tension between pro-slavery and anti-slavery, fighting as a fervent abolitionist, even fighting alongside the legendary abolitionist John Brown. On the summer after the war began, he was commissioned as colonel of the 2nd Kansas Infantry. The brigade that he was placed under was notorious for their Jayhawker style of fighting, more focused on raiding and freeing slaves, in which one historian described him as a sincere if unscrupulous anti-slavery zealot. In January of 1863, he was given the authorization to form his own regiment of African Americans in the South, using ex-slaves to create the 2nd South Carolina. However, unlike what Shaw did with the 54th, Montgomery seemed to never concern himself with installing discipline onto his soldiers, but I don't believe that it has anything to do with the belief that blacks made poor soldiers. The unit that he was part of prior to this held a reputation for being very undisciplined, so it shouldn't be any surprise that he wouldn't bother with it with his own black troops. Even so, he had military success with his 2nd South Carolina, such as his raid on Combahee Ferry where, with the help of Harriet Tubman, 800 slaves were freed. With this scene, the film continues with the trope that most, if not all, federal troops at every level of command held contempt for the notion of black soldiers. When comparing to the real Montgomery, while I couldn't find anything that suggests that he held the same viewpoints or not, but it would contradict his reputation as a strong-willed abolitionist, as they normally believed that African Americans were equal with whites. So the film does match his rhetoric when it came to Confederate sympathizers, even putting Shaw's own words into Montgomery's mouth.
You see, secession's got to be swept away by the hand of God like the Jews of old.
But when it came to Montgomery's brief yet significant view on African Americans, I believe that they may have taken some artistic liberties with his character. As for Shaw, he tried to resist Montgomery, stating that it went against the rules of war, but under the threat of losing his regiment to this madman, Shaw followed through with the eventual burning of the town. According to Egerton in his book, Shaw felt that the incident was both a violation of his personal code of honor and an assault on the integrity of his men. Speaking of which, while the film did seem to imply that the men probably felt the same way as their commander, they never actually talked about it amongst themselves. Not a single one voiced their opinion about what they did at Darien, and I think now it is the biggest missed opportunity. Because apparently many did have opinions about what happened, and to my surprise, most sided with Montgomery. Their biggest point of contention was that, with the recent declaration by the South where any Negro troop captured by the Confederates would be returned to slavery and any white officer found leading black troops would be killed, if the South would not fight fair, why should the North? In any case, Shaw made sure that he and his men would never be associated with Montgomery again. For the next month, the 54th pretty much waited while the plan for the invasion of Charleston was thought up and wondered what role they will have in it. In the meantime, they passed the long, hot, sweltering days by doing more fatigue work. By the end of June, another controversy would arise. Now, I did mention briefly the pay controversy at the end of the last chapter. In the film, it took place during the training phase, but in real life, it happened much later. If you've seen the film, then you would remember that the black troops were promised a $13 pay, the normal rate of a federal soldier, and yet were only given $10 all because they were Negro soldiers. This nearly caused a riot amongst the troops that was only silenced by Shaw, who managed to win over his men's trust when he himself refused his own pay in protest. You may think that it might be a bit hyperbolic, but surprisingly enough, the fact that they were black was the sole reason they were given low pay. Apparently there was a law known as the Militia Act that was passed the year before, and a part of it mentions pay for black laborers. It says that they will be paid out $10 per month, with $3 deducted for clothing. Now with African Americans enlisted as soldiers, it was decided that since white soldiers would be the only ones who will engage in the actual fighting, the black troops will be paid $10 under the assumption that they will only be used for manual labor. Shaw found it absolutely ridiculous and had his complaints known to Governor Andrews, who also felt the same way. However, as the War Department were basing this assumption on a law passed by Congress, they couldn't do anything about it until the next sessions, which would be the upcoming September. As such, Shaw and the majority of his men refused their pay, even rejecting Massachusetts' offer to pay the difference as they felt that the federal government was the one that needed to hold up their end of the bargain. By the 4th of July, the twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg signaled the approaching death of the Confederacy, which would mean the end of the war. Yet Shaw was determined to get his men into action to show the world the worth of the 54th. And that is the end of part 2. The third and final part will be coming up real soon. In the meantime, thank you for watching and have yourself a good day.